I feel really grateful to be here, both because I find these things really deeply terrifying, but also because I think it's helpful to be forced into a kind of vulnerability. As has already kind of been said earlier today and just kind of setting the tone for the space, this is really going to be an overview of a few things that I'd like us to kind of think about and consider. It's not going to be complete or authoritative, so please come and speak to me after I'm done talking. Ask questions. If there are things you disagree with, we can have like a really fruitful debate. Whatever your response is, like please come and engage with me. So just to give you a little bit more background about myself, I have a huge love for maps, for ways of visualizing data, and a lot of my work is really about the politics, the poetics, and a lot of the aesthetics of data visualization. And so I usually begin talks by introducing these two maps for a series of different reasons. The map on the left, or to kind of start before getting there, they're both maps of the same thing, right? They're both maps of the lower Mississippi River Valley. However, the map on the left is a lot more typical in terms of how we think about what the river is. It's denoted by the blue line. It's somewhat discrete. We think about it flowing from one direction to the next. It has a kind of like linear trajectory, and it's something that is somewhat contained. And the map on the right is one of my favorite maps of all time, made by Harold Fisk, and shows all the different alluvial paths that the Mississippi River has taken over time. And so this kind of really fundamentally restructures how we consider what the river is, but also brings up a lot of the politics of the construction of these two maps as well, right? So the map on the left lends itself to things like transportation, industry, commerce. It's also something that is built like literally by forced labor, by levee camps, by like plantation blocks in the South. And it's something that really fixes our idea of what the river is, its liveliness, and is something that's ultimately controllable. And the image on the right is something that's really effusive. It's something that flows in wildly different directions. And if anyone has spent time in cities like New Orleans, you would know that the river is the thing that deposits the silt and the soil downstream, right? It's the thing that literally builds the foundations that we stand on. And so I'm really interested in the things that are living in excess of containment, in excess of like clear logics that are axiomatic or that are discrete, that live in excess of the data set. And so this is a question that's been sitting with me with a lot of the work that I do, really asking, what are we making inherently unknowable by making the world more measurable, more familiar, and more predictable? And so there's kind of two things that are embedded in this question. One, it's like bringing attention to the fact that there are things that are left out of this kind of management and predictability, things that don't lend themselves to being enclosed within a data set or within a numeral, as well as it kind of positions unknowability as something that I think can be generative, right? So I don't want to make the assumption that the sort of desire to make something known or discrete is always the objective. I think there's something that is really fruitful in what can be clandestine or what moves kind of underneath the surface. And so a lot of my work now is really trying to investigate a kind of politics of unknowability as something that can be generative and productive. And so a lot of my past work was dealing with issues of racial violence within space, particularly historic and systemic racial violence within space. Like I said, my background is in working with maps and geospatial data. So I had done a lot of projects around redlining, the ways that race is kind of epidermalized and fixed to the body, and then the ways that bodies are fixed into spaces due to public policy largely, that works as a kind of dispossessive force, either extracting labor or removing value from particular spaces and cities. And redlining maps are a kind of very discrete example of this. So literally the red areas on the map were the areas where you could look at census data and see that Black people and new immigrants lived. And this was most consistently the metric that was used to assign risk to something like race. And in working and doing a lot of this work in the past, the redlined areas kind of take on their own narrative as well. They take on a narrative of dispossession, and it kind of does this there's this unintended consequence of kind of associating or naturalizing Blackness as something that's objection in the narratives that we tell about redlining and in the ways that we visualize the data to try and meaningfully intercede and interject new ways of thinking about racialized violence and how to represent it. So in trying to use data and trying to use maps as the kind of tool to kind of meaningfully engage in these histories, it almost does a disservice in that it essentializes those red areas as only sites of dispossession, as only sites of abjection, as only sites of violence, and then therefore kind of naturalizes those bodies to only being the victims of violence and not having their own responses as well. So this was a project that was trying to trouble a lot of that tension. The project was kind of geographically situated in Boston and was trying to chart the ways that groups of Black feminists, particularly the Combahee River Collective, was organizing around Boston by kind of adaptively reusing this devalued housing stock and kind of reappropriating it into a network of safe homes for Black women at the time. And so we were playing with like some stereoscopic printing to basically take the contours of the data, the actual shape files of those redlined areas in Boston, to scale them down and then to really flood the image with them, kind of making the case that if we only continue to try and understand the narratives of what happened in Boston and redlining through the data alone and through the shapefiles, then it obscures being able to see and understand what the land is underneath, right? And so then the cyan layer, the layer that you would see if you're using those little like decoder lenses, basically tells the story of the kind of spatial mobilization of the Combahee River Collective, again, reappropriating this housing stock that had been devalued due to redlining, and then putting it into a social technical network as a series of safe homes for Black women at the time in Boston. So it's trying to play with the tensions between those two layers and hopefully get to a kind of third space that's outside of this binary between what's fixed and discrete and then what's kind of wildly fluid and effusive, kind of coming back to the dichotomy between those two maps that we looked at. And I think this quote by Catherine McKittrick is really great at kind of synthesizing a lot of the concerns that I had about the use of maps and the use of data. I'm going to read it because I think it's actually worth saying it out loud. So many analyses of racial and spatial violence rely heavily on describing and redescribing spaces of absolute otherness, as well as the inhabitants of these spaces of otherness. It logically follows, because they are dead and dying, the condemned and without apparently have nothing to contribute to our broader intellectual project of ethically reimagining our ecocidal and genocidal world. Right, so McKittrick is really trying to bring our attention, again, to these unintended consequences of what it means to want to meaningfully analyze the racial violence within space and accidentally kind of naturalizing, again, the sort of inhabitants or the subjects of violence as being non-essential to having any of their own episteme or any of their own knowledge set to address some of those violences. What it also kind of does is that it relegates the tools of like geospatial information processing, mapping, as being these kind of like large-scale solutions for then trying to intercede into these problems, and then negates any kind of grounded, interpersonal, socially imbued responses as well, right? It kind of negates all of those things and makes them, again, kind of unknowable. So Catherine's work, and particularly this article, which I implore you all to read, on plantations, prisons, and a Black sense of place, has really crafted, I think, a new direction in my work in thinking about what the limitations, the kind of politics, and the underlying assumptions are with regards to the tools that we use and the kind of methods that we try to employ. And so this meant really trying to shift out of a like overtly analytical lens into something that is admittedly a lot more unwieldy. Looking at different types of epistemologies and ways of knowing that are not centered within the encapsulation of data and like formal analysis. And I'd like to say that I came to rituals out of a kind of epiphany of like intellectual wonder, but that's really not true. My investigation of thinking about rituals came at a time when I was in a lot of transition. So this past summer, I was at an artist residency in New Orleans and simultaneously preparing to move here from New York to start a PhD program. I recently had my heart broken by someone that I really loved and was now in this, in this artist residency trying to figure out what I was gonna do. And ritual became something that came out of necessity, really. And a necessity to have a kind of routine, a kind of consistent practice that allows you to weather the kind of flux, change, and really like lack of control of the external world, right? So ritual became its kind of knowledge structure to respond to flux, to respond to change that you have no control over. And so more specifically, I started wanting to ground ritual in different histories of radical Black tradition, primarily different rituals that contain both the production of media objects as well as the grounding of those objects in kind of social technical systems for creating circulation. And so the Negro Motors Green Book is a huge inspiration in doing so. There are a series of travel guides, quote unquote, that were first produced by a gentleman named Victor H. Green, who was a retired mailman working out of Hackensack, New Jersey. And basically he started publishing them in 1934 and stopped publishing them in 1965. And essentially they started listing city by city, state by state, all of the kind of quotidian everyday spaces that would cater or serve Black people at the height of Jim Crow. So things like hotels, motels, like bars, lounges. Sometimes individual homeowners would put their homes in the book as a kind of temporary guest house. And this became a way not just to mark like safe spaces, but it became a way to understand the real landscape and the way that the landscape of the US is inherently racialized and then to be able to navigate it. And so it does this work of looking at everyday sites and then kind of puts them into this network and allows them to become somewhat phenomenological and emergent. And the other thing that's particularly interesting about the guidebook is really how it's circulated. So Victor H. Green, as I said, was a retired mailman, and he basically uses his contacts within the Postal Workers Union to get in contact with Black mail workers who are walking their routes throughout the US. They're taking notes about the spaces that, again, cater to Black people, and then they're kind of recirculating all those notes back to Victor H. Green, who's compiling them and then sending them back out in circulation. So from the 1930s to the 1960s, Victor H. Green is essentially hacking the US Postal Service, making a kind of crowdsourced mechanism for allowing for the safe transportation of Black people across space that they're not supposed to be transgressing, right? So again, kind of decoupling the ways that race is essentialized to bodies and that geography becomes fixed based on that kind of logic, right? The logic of where Black people are allowed to be or not be. And so one of the other things I wanted to turn to are the freedom quotes. In a kind of similar vein, but a little bit different, the freedom quotes are basically a semiotic structure, like a structure of signage, embedded into actual quotes, mostly displayed in geometric patterns that were used to both mark spots along the Underground Railroad, as well as to communicate pretty specific and kind of detailed information about space. So as we can see here, these are kind of attempts by some academics in a really beautiful book called Hidden in Plain View, trying to look at the semiotics of the symbols that are used and then extract the kind of meaning. So again, these were patterns that were stitched into quilts that would be hung on homes that were safe houses within the Underground Railroad, but that would commute lots of different types of information. So like the log cabin, which is the second from the right on the top row, is meant to communicate a kind of safe house or a sanctuary. The monkey wrench was, again, in that same row, but on the far left, is trying to detail that this is a place where you will need to gather tools for the survival ahead, as well as others that are trying to say this is the place where you need to kind of masquerade as a free person and to put on clean clothes, right? So it's pretty detailed, a really detailed understanding of space, communicated through the medium of the quilt itself, and then displayed throughout space to both mark safe houses and have a kind of live updating system about the politics of how race and space converge for people that are escaping slavery. And so in thinking about these things as ritual practice, I wanted to kind of test myself to work outside of the disciplines of formal analysis, use of geospatial data, and then experiment with installation as a kind of form for what the data set can be. That's very much premised on ritual. And so appropriating the log cabin pattern, I wanted to return to some of my own rituals of protection and cohesion, and to be able to layer installation so that there are multiple forms of reading. So what you're seeing is like a large quilt built into the structure of the log cabin, made out of strips of newspaper. And the strips of newspaper are important because it dates back to another West African tradition of being able to ward off bad or evil spirits, the idea being that the written word was so sacred that even a spirit would have to honor it by trying to read it or decipher it. So if you were to cut it into strips and scramble it and line the inside of your home, evil spirits would have to try and scramble or decode that message before they could enter your house. So I wanted to both layer that on top of the semiotics of the log cabin, and then was playing with a lot of conductive material to make the quilt itself something that is a lot more effusive, that is alive. So taking field recordings throughout New Orleans, looping them, modulating them through Ableton, and then putting my own voice, my own voice on top of that, sort of as a meditation of my own practices of ritual and protection, made 3 experimental audio pieces that are then kind of stitched into the quilt as a soft circuit. So as you touch different parts of the quilt, you'll hear those field recordings of New Orleans, you'll hear my voice kind of walking through my own patterns and rituals of protection, kind of layered on these older historic diasporic forms of, again, moving across space and thinking about the context of race and space and needing protection. And so this is really where a lot of my work is starting to go now, in these kind of experimental forms to think through what the data set can potentially be, again, grounded in a different kind of epistemology, one that's not so premised in discrete notions of data and analysis, but one that's rested a little bit more in the body, in social practice, and is rich in ritual as a very sophisticated, sort of like right into knowledge production in itself. And so the thing that I kind of want to close on is in the embrace of unknowability a little bit. It took a lot to transition from making admittedly strange maps into trying to make sound installations. But I think there's something really important about being honest about the limitations of the tools and the methods that you use. There's a lot that can be done within them, but I think there's a lot that can be done in being honest, again, about what it doesn't allow you to do, and to kind of be comfortable sitting in the discomfort of the unknown, and pushing yourself into different methodological practices. So I think I'm over time, but I'm going to leave it there. Thank you.